Okay, let's begin. Good evening. I'm Todd Lefko, Chairperson of East-West Connections. I wish to thank our co-sponsors, the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, Global Minnesota, and the marvelous Museum of Russian Art. East-West Connections is focused upon citizen diplomacy. There are different forms of diplomacy which often determine the difference between war and peace. Tonight, we have three of the top practitioners of the art of diplomacy discussing the present and future of this art. To guide our discussion, we are pleased and honored to have Minnesota's expert on foreign affairs, the distinguished foreign diplomat Tom Hanson, whom we happily refer to as our Norwegian crown jewel. Tom will introduce our honored guests. Thomas, take it away.
Thank you, Todd, for that introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be with you all this evening to talk about diplomacy, and especially U.S. diplomacy, what the landscape is right now, also some of the traditions that sort of influence it. I'm a former Foreign Service officer, as are our two other speakers, Margo Squire, who had a long and illustrious career as a public affairs officer in the Department of State, and Ross Wilson, who also a long career and also as ambassador to numerous countries, including Turkey, and recently the final acting ambassador in Afghanistan. So both Margo and Ross have extensive and most importantly of all, up-to-date experience in U.S. diplomacy. So we'll be very interested in their insights as the program progresses. I will kick things off now with just a few remarks or points about the traditions of U.S. foreign policy. As they say, past is prologue. And I think understanding a few key points about the background of American diplomacy can help us in our discussion going forward. So first point I'd like to make is that there's a distinction between foreign policy and diplomacy. They're not the same thing. Foreign policy is the policy of the country. It's set by the country's political leaders. And one of the instruments of that foreign policy and the promotion of U.S. national interests is diplomacy. And in the United States, that means the career diplomacy of the Foreign Service. One of the themes that we'll be discussing tonight is the struggle that we've always had in our country to maintain a professional diplomatic service. And the struggle is ongoing. Diplomacy is one of the components of the instruments for foreign policy. In Washington, especially in the Pentagon, people speak of DIME, D-I-M-E, which means diplomacy, intelligence, military, and economic. And by the way, economic these days is one of the most important because that's sanctions. And sanctions are used heavily right now in promoting our national power in the world. Some people will say information under the I as opposed to intelligence, but anyway, it's called DIME. And so how has this one component, one instrument of U.S. foreign policy evolved in the U.S. over time? I think there are two factors that we have to focus on at the outset. One is the benevolent geographic position of our country, which has allowed us from the very first to focus on our own development, a kind of a splendid isolation in the 19th century, which also has allowed domestic politics to influence greatly our foreign policy. A country like China has to be constantly using diplomacy actively to create a peaceful environment. It's bordered by 14 countries. We are so fortunate that our geography doesn't present that kind of a problem, but it's got a downside, and that is that diplomacy has not always received the backing that it should. The second factor about America that's somewhat unique is our separation of powers between the judicial, legislative, and executive branch, what people call the invitation to struggle, which is a big part of our democracy. And so the Senate especially has the power of declaring war, ratifying treaties, and approving ambassadorial appointments. So power is somewhat divided. It's not always exercised. I think the Congress has not been exercising its power to declare war. in recent decades. But theoretically, it is a very divided, separated power that our country enjoys. So it's this combination of factors, influence of Congress, influence of geography, that really framed the 19th century of our diplomacy. Our early early presidents all warned against entangling alliances. Our first ambassador was appointed in 1893, the first official U.S. ambassador. Before that, we had ministers only, who were very low ranking, at the bottom of the protocol list in whatever country they were in, and there were very few of them, because Congress was skeptical of diplomacy. It was too European somehow, and always tried to keep the numbers down in our diplomatic services. A official history of the Foreign Service, published by the Department of State in 1961, gave the following assessment of our early diplomacy, really up until the 20th century. And they wrote, haphazard organization, uncertainty of tenure, inadequate compensation, and absence of any logical system of recruitment and promotion tended through most of the 19th century to restrict the diplomatic service to a small group of relatively wealthy, and to make the consular service the victim of the political spoilsman. It was part of what they used to call the spoils system. Up until 1895, the U.S. diplomatic service and the consular service were kept separate, and they were very different. So by 1901, the U.S. Department of State in Washington had a mere 82 employees and just 35 missions abroad, staffed with ambassadors only since 1893, and fewer than 70 diplomats. In contrast, the consular service had ballooned to 323 posts abroad, employing over 1,000 people. And this was a patronage network through and through. So after World War I, with the U.S. role increasing, the Rogers Act of 1924 created the modern Foreign Service. It tried to cut through the spoils system that had existed with a Foreign Service exam, which still exists. You could only come in through examination. So people like George Kennan entered, as opposed to just kind of well-connected people. By 1937, nearly half of U.S. ambassadors were career Foreign Service officers. Now, the legacy of that 19th century consular spoils system continues and impacts the Foreign Service today, because between a third and recently 40%, up to 40% of our ambassadors are still political appointees, many of whom have given money to campaigns. And this is really it's sort of the natural legacy of this old consular service. And it makes us very different from other developed countries. There really isn't any other developed country that does it this way, with that degree of really what you might call a spoils system. So kind of zipping forward to get to our present discussion, with the Cold War, several things happened that impacted our diplomacy and the State Department. Number one, the National Security Council was created. And this created a different center of influence right close to the White House. The State Department was moved down to Foggy Bottom. Location is very important in terms of influence. And so from then on, you've had a kind of a back and forth between the National Security Council and the State Department. Second, in the early 1970s, because of Vietnam and Watergate, Congress really asserted itself to become more active in foreign affairs. It voted to multiply the number of subcommittees. Tip O'Neill used to joke whenever he met a new congressman whose name he didn't know, he'd just say, Mr. Chairman, because there were so many new committees, and this was, the State Department had to appear on the Hill often to meet this new requirement coming out of the Congress. Then the third development after the NSC and the congressional assertion was the security issue that developed with terrorism and the creation of DS at the State Department, the Department of State Security apparatus, which has grown. It's very necessary and very important to protect our diplomats, but there's a constant balancing that needs to be done between security and outreach. We can't have our embassies just sort of buttoned down for security reasons. Diplomats have to get out So this is a part of our diplomacy now, which is new. Very quickly, in the 1990s, new stresses came on the State Department. The collapse of the Soviet Union and of Yugoslavia led to the creation of new countries and new embassies that had to be staffed. This happened just as the Clinton administration was beginning to cut foreign affairs funding under the Reinventing Government program. Since the 1990s, foreign affairs funding has declined by 30%, at least. And so you have these new responsibilities, new embassies to fill, and fewer resources to do this with. With 9/11, new responsibilities came up to our diplomacy, fighting the war on terror, a kind of a more expeditionary diplomacy, expeditionary foreign service evolved, staffing Baghdad and Kabul. A lot of positions were taken out of our traditional embassies, put into these new expeditionary posts. This eventually became transformational diplomacy. Once again, this was not funded. The State Department was taking on more and more new missions without the personnel or the funding really to back them up. So I'd say 2017 or so, or rather 2007, 2008, when Obama came in, there were many studies from the American Academy of Diplomacy, Georgetown University, others, recommending that the Foreign Service be at least doubled to meet all these new requirements that had been placed upon it. And there was an attempt to increase the Foreign Service in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, but then in 2010, the sequester entered in, and the numbers have been stagnant or even declining ever since. So it's a Foreign Service that needs bolstering. One of the strongest advocates for more money for state has been the Pentagon. People like Robert Gates, when he was Defense Secretary, pointing out that there were more people in Pentagon marching bands than there were in the entire Foreign Service, for example. So there's a lot to be done. And the final shift in all of this is 2017, our new national security strategy, which has changed the focus from terrorism and transformational diplomacy, theoretically, to great power competition. The need to prevent the rise of peer competitors, the need to prevent any power from dominating its region the way we dominate ours. And of course, that means China and Russia in Asia and in Europe especially. So once again, new tasks, new orientations for the Foreign Service. There's a desire to make the Foreign Service and a need to make it more diverse. And so a lot is being reconsidered now in terms of recruitment. It's an organization and a diplomatic service that is evolving. And so there's a lot to talk about tonight, which direction that should take. But I'll just finish by saying that the main issue, really, in my mind at least, is that we need to keep a professional foreign service somehow, a professional diplomacy, the way most people do, most countries do. China vastly outspends us on its diplomacy. And so to the extent that we underfund the professional service and populate our, not only our embassies, but also the State Department increasingly with political appointees, we risk going back to the old spoils system, which we thought theoretically had gotten out of starting already in 1924. So I will stop there, and it's a great pleasure now to turn things over to Margo Squire. We can get into the real nitty-gritty of what it's like to be a diplomat, what's happening out there real time. So Margo, it's a pleasure. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Tom. I'm very pleased to be here, part of this discussion. Besides being a retired Foreign Service officer myself, I'm also third generation. My grandfather was a Foreign Service officer, my father as well. And I'm proud of the work that I have done, first and foremost in service to my country. It was wonderful to get back to that service in Afghanistan after 6 years. To see the same degree of commitment to service and desire to help Americans in those currently serving. But I thought I would give some of the basics of what it is to be a Foreign Service officer. And unfortunately, I feel like it's one of the best kept secrets that we have in the US. You know, most of us through our career, when we said foreign service, have been asked Forest Service, or when we say we work for the State Department, people ask which state. So I think it's just easier to say diplomat. And the reason that it's not known is that most of the work is done overseas, behind the scenes, out of the news, and you want it to stay that way. It's rare, and it's not usually for a good reason when a diplomat or an ambassador becomes a household name. And just to give a little bit of history, we have had diplomats before we had a country. So a year before the Declaration of Independence, our Continental Congress sent Benjamin Franklin to France, where he successfully managed to, gain support for our cause against a much more powerful Britain. And likewise, we had diplomats in England during our Civil War, and they kept the British from supporting the Confederacy and remaining more neutral. So at a more basic level, today's Foreign Service officers work for the US Department of State. They also work for the US Agency for International Development. They work for the US Commerce Department and also the US Agricultural Service, which has a foreign commercial service. And as Tom said, you have to pass a test, you have to pass a medical and a security clearance. It's rather like joining the military. You get a commission and you are sworn in. You take an oath of office promising to support the Constitution, and you agree not to support any political party or candidate, but rather whatever administration is in power. And that is sort of the guiding light of the career Foreign Service. Diplomats work in more than 270 embassies, consulates, and other diplomatic missions around the world, protecting Americans, supporting our national interests and policies. There are different positions. They're called political officers, economic officers, consular, but the names are not important. Generally, in the course of your career, you change over the different jobs, excuse me, and they differ from country to country depending on our national interests. But some of the examples of what we're doing around the world. So in Turkey and in India, diplomats are stressing the need to take a stronger stance against Russia. In Brazil, they're probably reaching out to both sides of the presidential race, Bolsonaro and also Luiz da Silva, to gauge their views and determine how we can work better with whoever wins the next round of voting. Diplomats negotiate agreements to reduce the spread of weapons and work with countries to secure weapons of mass destruction. One of my favorite pictures and mementos of my father is at the signing of the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in Moscow. He had worked on the buildup to that treaty, and it is still the most durable arms control treaty that there is. FSOs also help US businesses to promote trade and support our economic interests. Developing sanctions, as Tom said, when necessary, making sure that countries live up to them, like pushing China to uphold sanctions on North Korea for developing nuclear weapons. We provide humanitarian assistance to countries that are hit by natural disasters, like flooding in Pakistan, or provide food assistance to countries experiencing drought in Africa. We also provide cradle-to-grave support to Americans overseas, registering a baby's birth for an American businessman living in Germany, or a member of the US military serving in Korea, helping tourists get home who've lost or had a passport stolen, visiting Americans in jail, advocating for the release of American prisoners, like Brittany Griner in Russia. And finally, the sad task of calling family members when there's an American who's died overseas. And how do we do this? We do this by being overseas, working, meeting with people, and listening to people. It's what Edward R. Murrow called that last 5 feet. the distance from person to person, or at least before COVID, when it sort of expanded to 6 feet. But he had worked in CBS TV and radio. He was also the director under JFK of the US Information Agency, but he knew it wasn't enough to just broadcast or to call people or to talk to people over Zoom. You have to look someone in the eye. You have to be able to follow the local customs to understand and be understood. Drink those 3 cups of tea in order to gain trust. And back to Benjamin Franklin, John Adams joined him in France, and he sent criticism back. He wrote, and sent letters back saying that he's partying too much. He's spending too much time at dinner parties and not enough time working. And this has also been a common criticism of diplomats, that we go to dinners, we go to cocktail parties. Well, actual fact is this is work. Every dinner or reception is an opportunity to talk and to listen and build that relationship that we may need someday to keep our country safe. Because you get closer to people when you share a meal. Those of us, you remember what it's like sitting around a table, like Moscow, in a kitchen table, hitting knee to knee over tea and perhaps something stronger. This principle is exemplified in the area of diplomacy where I think I worked the most, which was public diplomacy, involving direct communication with publics. So on the one hand, public diplomacy is supporting those people-to-people exchanges, educational exchanges between the US and other countries, like the Fulbright Scholars or high school exchanges, the Future Leaders Exchange, that stresses is direct, vital information, contact is vital to understanding. And in fact, Senator Fulbright said that the educational exchange can turn nations into people and contributing to the humanizing of international relations. And we need to continue these, and we need to increase these exchanges, especially with countries in which we're having problems at the government-to-government level. The other side of public diplomacy is explaining US policy to foreign publics. From my time when I served in Moscow in the late 80s to my last job at the State Department on weapons of mass destruction, we needed to reach out directly and talk with journalists, talk with non-governmental organizations, reach publics to get our views understood. Initially in Moscow, when I served there, it was through calling people on the phone, faxing people, and we would then, write up a telegram on a typewriter and send it back to Washington reporting on this. Well, thank goodness communications has, rapidly expanded, and now we have, laptops and internet, and most reports are done by email and instant messaging and texts, WhatsApp, probably more than any other means of communication, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all of these ways to reach people directly and quickly. And, and in the future, diplomats will have to be trained and encouraged to communicate more with publics and to be more open and flexible. And I think that a great example is what we're seeing right now with during the war in Ukraine. The amount of public information that's being shared by the US government, to me, is astounding and incredibly refreshing. And we're seeing, the Ukrainian government, from President Zelensky through diplomats around the world, they're out there, they're visible, they're speaking to people and anyone that they can reach, and they're speaking openly and candidly, and they've been encouraged to do so. Contrast that with the Russians, starting with their president, foreign minister, and permanent representative at the UN, and it looks like they're still speaking from the old Soviet playbook, threatening and scowling, reminiscent of Nikita Khrushchev pounding his shoe. So that direct communication at people to people level is very important. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to pass it over to Ross. I think I was supposed to introduce where I was serving, but most of the places that I served were with him, luckily, in Moscow. He also served in Czechoslovakia when it was still Czechoslovakia, in Baku, in Melbourne, Australia, in many times in Washington, D.C., as ambassador, both in Azerbaijan and in Turkey, and then most recently as chargé running the embassy in Afghanistan. So, Ross.
Thank you very much, Margo. It's a great pleasure and honor to be able to share this platform with Tom and Margo. Both of them, all three of us, had distinguished careers representing the United States of America overseas, and each of us can point to many areas where we made a difference for our country. Whether the difference involved an individual who needed help, and we perhaps as consular officers were able to make that happen, or on any of a long list of kind of high-profile policy issues where our reporting, our insight, our recommendations affected the future trajectory of U.S. foreign policy in any of a variety of places. I want to follow up on a couple of things that Margo said, and talk a little bit about what we do in a slightly different way. Diplomats, at the end of the day, the comparative advantage that we have, or a key comparative advantage that we have that foreign service officers have over other U.S. government representatives abroad is relationship building, and building relationships not around a narrow interest of exports or of drug trafficking or any of a variety of specific things, but relationships that are bigger than that and that have more to do both with the day-to-day conduct of American foreign policy abroad, but really more importantly with the long-term ability of the United States to protect its interests. The kind of exchange programs and other programs, some of the other programs Margo referred to, are not about today's foreign policy agenda. They're about making friends for our country, or at least increasing the cadre of foreigners who have been here and who understand this country. Maybe they like it, maybe they don't, but they'll know more for the experience of having come here. And that relationship building, I think, I've always thought is fundamental to what we do. One mentor of mine used the expression, foreign relations is about relations with foreigners. You have to have relations with foreigners if you're going to have foreign relations. Some of those foreigners we don't like. Some of them are not nice people. Some of them do terrible things to their own people. One of the things we do as diplomats, or we try to do where it's at all possible, is to talk to them, to try to understand them, to report back to Washington on what are they thinking? What are they looking for? What are their goals? What kind of people are they? How, if at all, can we influence them through things we might say, things we might do, things we might provide, things that we might withhold? But that relationship building is kind of unique is I think a unique part of the Foreign Service. We have these relationships to secure American interests, to help our government secure American interests abroad, to protect Americans abroad. Margo referred to passport services, getting people out of jail, trying to help them in a whole variety of areas. So carrying out our nation's interests with respect to the messaging that we do. Now, increasingly, and this is part of the new Foreign Service, social messaging. These are not always elaborately thought out or concocted written press statements. That's not the way the world works, and that's an area where the Foreign Service has had to evolve. And a lot of reporting and analysis. I remember with the explosion of satellite television and then the internet, many predicted, or some predicted, that the reporting and analysis function of American embassies overseas would wither away because Washington could get its information in through other channels. It's actually not the case. There's too much information that comes through those other channels. Effective diplomats overseas, grounded in the history and the politics and the social character of the countries that they live in, knowing American priorities and interests in that specific context, can develop information, report sensibly back to Washington on it in a manner that no journalist for the New York Times, no blogger, no social media actor can possibly duplicate. And that's kind of a cool thing. I think all three of us found that to be a cool thing in the work that we did. Second point I'd make, and here I'll differ a little bit from some of the things that Tom and Margo said. I think of, there's the Foreign Service. I don't necessarily define the Foreign Service as just diplomats. Embassies are not just Foreign Service personnel. In fact, most embassies certainly have a distinct minority of State Department personnel, but they probably have a minority of Foreign Service personnel. When you think about the variety of other agencies that are represented there, Margo referred to the foreign services of USAID, Commerce, the Department of Agriculture. The Treasury Department has a small foreign attaché contingent. The Drug Enforcement Agency is involved in many embassies overseas. In Afghanistan, of course, it was big business for good reasons. The FBI has representatives in most embassies overseas, certainly larger ones. The inspectors general of the State Department and sometimes AID, as well as other agencies represented at our embassy. You've got a whole lot of other players. And I think one of the challenges, and here we're wearing my ambassadorial hat, one of the challenges, maybe one of the biggest challenges that leaders of our embassies have, is to try to make that diverse set of actors, those diverse agency cultures. There's a different culture at the Department of Defense. There's a different culture at Treasury, a different culture certainly at a place like DEA or the FBI. That making sure that all of those pieces act in some reasonably coherent way, in a manner so that the United States can be as effective as we need to be on as many issues as we need to be, and that one agency's gain doesn't come at the expense of another one's interest. This issue of organizing the United States effectively to deal with foreigners is something that I particularly picked up when I was in Turkey. We had 19 agencies represented at the American Embassy in Ankara, 2 constituent posts in Istanbul and Adana. There were other people, particularly the second time I went back as chargé, other people in Turkey working along the southern border with Syria. This was in 2014. When the rise of ISIS in Syria and Iraq had started to develop the large wave of Syrian migrants, refugees flowing into Turkey and beyond into Europe. Lots of people doing lots of things that even to me often looked confusing and incoherent. To foreign governments in Turkey and most countries, it looks confusing and incoherent. And so a big part of the job, as I said, is to, at an embassy, is to try to organize the US government, the agencies that are represented at posts, as well as their headquarters offices, because they're taking instructions from their headquarters, to make sure that we all acted as a team as much as was possible to carry out our objectives. And they're an important addition to what Tom had said. One of the enshrined roles of ambassadors is not to be the representative of the State Department. You're the president's personal representative, and you are personally responsible for all of the actions of all U.S. government agencies in your country, with the sole exception of military personnel operating under the authority of a combatant commander. So to get specific here, any U.S. military that we may have that we had in Afghanistan, any that we may have in Ukraine, they don't come under the control of our ambassadors to those countries, but everybody else does. And even that military piece, coordinating that and relating the pieces together, big business. And in my case in Afghanistan, it was very big business. A third thing I think I'd talk a little bit about the Foreign Service. Margo, or either Margo or Tom, referred to sort of changes in the Foreign Service. When I joined, when I first started in the State Department in 1978, the place was overwhelmingly white and male. I have easily 95, if not 98 or 99%. In fact, my Foreign Service class was delayed. The entry on duty of my Foreign Service class was delayed because the Carter administration had basically, the White House had established a quota that there had to be a certain either number or percentage of the class, but I think it was a raw number, before the class could begin. And so my class was delayed for a couple of months until enough additional women.
And you were talking about women, sorry to interject.
Sorry, I was talking about women. Enough additional women had passed all the tests and checks and everything else that you have to go through. Fast forward to today, the Foreign Service classes are probably over 50% women. I'm not sure that we're at the point yet where a majority of our career ambassadors are women, but we're definitely headed in that direction. In my service overseas, in Baku as ambassador in Baku, Turkey, and Afghanistan, I had a woman as my deputy each time. One of those became ambassador, later the foreign policy advisor to Kamala Harris at the beginning of the Biden administration. Change has been going on for the last 30 years, and after a certain period of time, it actually does begin to have impact. However, the story remains quite different with respect to minorities, and that is a sad fact of the Foreign Service. It undoubtedly reflects a whole variety of things. The State Department has recently begun a kind of more concerted effort than I've seen in my time involved there to try to remedy that. Changes are being carried out in the exam and entrance process to not just to eliminate bias, but to really more affirmatively try to find ways to ensure that the Foreign Service more fully represents the diversity of the American society, and that I think is very much a work in progress. A second foreign service piece, or maybe a third Foreign Service piece I'd mention is staffing. Staffing goes up, staffing goes down. Hiring goes up, hiring goes down. There was a big boom in hiring in the early 2000s when Colin Powell was Secretary of State. There was a second boom when Condoleezza Rice was there. There was a long-term hiring freeze that I think was actually initiated at the tail end of the Obama administration and carried well into the Trump administration, such that today the Foreign Service is quite significantly understaffed. Positions are vacant all over the world, and it has the unfortunate effect of playing out most specifically in the consular function with respect to visas, passports, services to American citizens, because new Foreign Service officers very typically go into those positions. Some of them, particularly visa officers, not always the Henry Kissinger-like foreign policy experience that many people want and aspire to, and that they go into the Foreign Service to try to get to. It's kind of a rite of passage we all do, but then of the people, there's not the intake to try to effectively accommodate that. Challenges looking ahead, or challenges today that I see. One is security. There are many posts around the world that are in such insecure places that that officers, Foreign Service personnel can't take their families or dependents with them. That imposes a quite significant hardship on the family, and I know this from personal experience. There are even tougher posts. Afghanistan, our embassy in Kabul sadly is no longer in this category, but certainly Baghdad is, Mogadishu is. There are a number of very, very, very tough and dangerous places that pose extremely onerous conditions on the ability of diplomats to get out and build personal relationships. You can't, it's hard to do on the phone. It's hard to do via Zoom. You get to have a relationship, you actually need to sit down with somebody. And that's pretty tough, and that's a challenge that the Foreign Service and our people have to try to grapple with, and our leaders have to grapple with, balancing the requirements of security with the other requirements of American foreign policy around the world to accurately understand what's going on in the countries that we care about. I think a second big challenge is this multiplicity of agencies. There are all these other actors. When we in Kabul convened meetings, which we did, more or less on a weekly, if not more frequent basis, on kind of specific, relatively specific problems, I would have officers from 5, 6, 7 different agencies who were represented in this. A tough challenge just to get everybody in the room and figure out who's doing what. In a circumstance where a lot of the senior officers, and I put myself in this category, don't entirely understand all those other pieces. The younger officers who have come in more recently, in some ways, a little bit more adept in dealing with this proliferation of different actors at our posts overseas. But it is a big problem. A third is that staffing problem. There are not enough people. Even at one of our very, very highest profile posts, Kabul, Afghanistan, before August 2021, we had a substantial number of vacant positions that the State Department couldn't fill. And you kind of ask, well, what exactly is higher than we asked? What's higher than we are on the food chain? Well, there were other things on the food chain, and in any case, there was sometimes an acute shortage of personnel. And maybe a last, just to hearken back to the not too distant past, the last issue is the confidentiality of what we do. We develop relationships with people. We report on what those people say, not necessarily on a meeting with, a meeting I have with Margo Squire that gets reported, but you research views and thinking on a topic or a set of topics. You in the write-ups that you do, you report on what it is that people had to say, and their names in there. And how many years ago was the whole WikiLeaks leak? And there have been other subsequent data dumps that put out into the public domain these conversations. They're not like, the most sensitive thing in the whole world. But on the other hand, the effect of that in quite a number of cases was to destroy relationships and undermine trust that our foreign colleagues had in the United States, and when what they expected and we expected would be confidential conversations. I think a last big one is adapting to the whole very rapid change in the way information gets reported. In my service in Afghanistan, especially, I was just overwhelmed by the extent to which so much of what we do is reported not through traditional telegrams that Margo mentioned, not even emails, but by other very, very rapid ways to convey information, but also very ephemeral ways that, it's gone in a half-life is a nanosecond, and almost impossible to recover over time, and because of the brevity that's involved in a WhatsApp message, for example, almost devoid of context, which was our kind of whole reason for being there. There's a lot there. Probably we've gone on too long, but I hope this has given a sense of what some of the things that we do and some of the challenges we face. I'll turn it back over to Tom.
Thanks so much, Ross. That was very, very comprehensive and informative. And thank you, Margo, too. Diversity really is key, as you pointed out, within an embassy, all the different agencies, and of course, in the State Department. As they used to say for the old Foreign Service, it was Yale, pale, and male. And thank goodness those days are long over. It's a much more diverse service with a lot more to do. So we're ready now for questions and answers. Please submit your question in the Q&A function. I'll be tracking them, and we have quite a few that have already come in here now. One question, Ross and Margo, COVID-19, of course, has changed diplomacy in the past couple of years. I'm sure when you were in Afghanistan, that must have been an issue. I mean, in terms of managing the embassy, in terms of all kinds of aspects of diplomacy. How would you describe how state is handling the COVID era?
COVID clearly traumatized the United States and American society, and embassies were disrupted at least as much. In Kabul, we were favored, actually. We were among the very first to get the vaccine overseas because of the extreme shortage, or really unavailability, of proper medical care if we had any kind of significant outbreak. For the better part of a year, our officers had to, and even I, with the president of the country, had to revert to Zoom or a virtual platform, or sometimes the telephone to do our business. It wasn't too disruptive in the spring of 2020 because people had been in the country. They developed some personal relationships with their contacts at government offices, civil society out around the country. But when the rotation happened, the summer rotation, new people came in. The newcomers, I think, found it extremely difficult to figure out, to establish a relationship and thereby develop a decent understanding of what was happening there. COVID was also extremely disruptive to our one of the key outward-facing parts of our mission and worldwide, and that's the consular function. Consular functions basically stopped operating on any kind of a non-emergency basis. Couldn't get passports, you couldn't get visas. In Afghanistan, the part that was of most concern to us was the whole special immigrant visa program that enabled those who served our country to come to the United States. And so huge delays in that, very, very disruptive. Well, we got through it, but it was, as far as the State Department as a whole, my sense is that as America's returned more sort of to normal, our embassies have done the same as well.
Tom, I see a number of personnel questions, which I'd be happy to just take right away.
Yeah, because there's things like, are people still interested? Can seniors serve in the Foreign Service? Yeah, why don't you take those?
By law, Foreign Service officers have to resign at age 65. There are some special circumstances for ambassadors, but that's basically the case. And so you can serve as long as when you join the service, you're not older than 59. I believe that's the cutoff. And I remember my Foreign Service class, I had a 57-year-old. I was 27. And this person was 57, starting at the same time. And the idea is that you get, I think, at least 2 overseas assignments, or maybe it's 3 assignments. There was a question about new Americans. So presumably these are people who have just gotten citizenship in the United States and getting to serve America in the Foreign Service. Basically, the requirement is that you are a US citizen, I think 21 years of age, and you have to pass all of the, the exams, and you have to the tests to get in. But there are a number of new Americans over the course of my career that I saw. Many had worked for our embassies overseas as local employees in those embassies. They came to the United States, they became American citizens, and they joined the Foreign Service because basically they had done the work of diplomats in their own country for us. They loved that work and wanted to continue it. There's a question about knowledge of language and culture. And I think this is something that our diplomatic service takes very seriously. I served for 3 years at the Foreign Service Institute, where diplomats are trained. I was in the leadership school, but language training is very important. Positions around the world are usually language designated, which means that you have to speak the language and pass a test to be able to serve in those positions. So so we train others to have those languages to a much greater degree than I would say other foreign diplomatic services do. And part of that training is also in cultural awareness and area studies. How do female diplomats overcome cultural hurdles in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, etc.? So I remember very, very early on, one Foreign Service officer, a woman saying, who worked in Saudi Arabia, said, to a certain extent, she felt that it was an advantage because the Saudis didn't know how to relate to her as a woman in the position that she had with as a diplomat. So often they create this like third category. Okay, this isn't a person who's a male or a female. This is an American diplomat, generic diplomat, and they get the same or equal or access as other male diplomats would. And I think that's the case in most countries. I think in a lot of countries, people cover their heads. American women diplomats would cover your head if you're out in the street, just in keeping with the social norms. But it's really dependent on the country. In some places, it's an advantage to be a female diplomat. I remember a female diplomat who served in the Middle East in a number of countries told me that she was able to meet with women in a way that her male colleagues could not. So she could not only meet with males, but she could also, like at an entertainment event, at a dinner or something, when the males and females were separated, she could meet with the females in the way that her male counterparts could not. So, when you think of that, that's 50% of a population. So there are ways to get around the cultural hurdles, and generally, I think being male, female, whatever gender is not a problem. Trying to think if there's another one.
And just to pick up on one that was there, Margo, is there interest in joining the Foreign Service nowadays? And I would just note that it's really varied. So in 2010, Business Week did its annual hottest employer survey, where they asked about 57,000 college students in 350 colleges what their desired profession would be. And State Department came in number 6, right behind Google and Apple at that point, which is almost hard to imagine because in recent years, the number of applicants taking the exam has decreased very significantly. So we might be, with the reforms underway, perhaps we'll be coming into a time now where there'll be more and more applicants going forward. But so it's really varied quite a bit. So one question was asking about subnational diplomacy. Apparently, a new envoy has been named at state or a position on subnational diplomacy, and this gets into the role of cities and states at that level, many of whom have active diplomacy. Sister city programs on climate change, a lot of the international activity is going on at that level. So what have you seen sort of in that subnational realm?
Well, I would just say, first of all, that chambers of commerce, I think, have always been very active, promoting trade, for example. And that's, so, I mean, I welcome this whole idea of subnational level diplomacy. Ross?
I would just say state many years ago, and I think this was maintained, had a kind of liaison to state and local governments in the United States as a kind of place that those entities could go at the State Department to get guidance and how to contact who at what embassy to deal with, to help them do what they wanted to do, whether it's promoting trade or investment or people-to-people contacts, whatever. I personally am not a huge fan of special envoys working problems abroad. It's not real clear to me how an envoy like that is going to work effectively with subnational governments in 156 countries. We have embassies to do that. They do. When I was in Australia, I made a point of visiting a couple of times a year, at least a couple of times a year, each of the 4 states of Australia that were part of my consular district. I think that's normal and standard stuff. We do probably fall short, again, because of the broader shortage of personnel that Tom referred to, leaving aside more recent shortfalls in numbers. We fall short in our ability to kind of work on an ongoing way on issues like climate change or global health issues or any of a variety of topics. But, we're not able effectively to do that, but we have missions overseas. That's part of their jobs.
We have a question about political appointees. We mentioned that a bit in our introductions. What's the status now? Are there more of them, less of them? What impact does that have on our diplomacy to have so many outside appointees coming in and who don't have the background in diplomacy?
So I believe typically in an administration, during the first couple of years, a relatively large share, maybe even a third of their ambassadorial appointments are political appointees. And as time goes on, especially in a second term when there are fewer political debts to repay, and those serving in offices at the State Department and the White House come to appreciate the relationships that they have made and the expertise that they have found in our own foreign service, the career people take a larger and larger share. It ranges between about 2/3, 1/3, sometimes 3/4, 1/4 career versus political. There are some in the Foreign Service who are very kind of, actually most, who are very kind of closed shop when they think about non-career ambassadors taking posts overseas. There are certainly many, many cases of people who are not competent for that kind of work. Maybe they were competent in working in other international settings, but not that one. There are others that I've worked with who were quite impressive. In 2005, I went to China, accompanying a senior State Department official for talks with the Chinese. And so I looked up our ambassador there, and he was a guy named Clark Rand, who, what I was told was, actually, before I looked him up, he was President Bush's roommate at Yale. And my reaction was, well, that's just great. You roommate, and then you get China. I mean, this is a serious embassy. After Yale, Clark Rand had spent his life in China. He'd learned fluent Mandarin. he was well-versed both in the business goings and comings, but also with a whole range of political circles. He was an absolutely outstanding representative for the United States. And he as a political appointee and as a personal friend of the president had something that an asset no Foreign Service officer had. He could get the president on the phone. And when there were crises early during the Bush administration in U.S.-Chinese relations, that proved absolutely critical. So, I mean, they bring different skills, and those who are clearly not qualified don't really belong. And sometimes the Senate filters them out, but they do bring some assets to the table that can be quite important.
I think one change worth mentioning, I mean, in addition to as Ross is pointing out, the political appointees as ambassadors coming out of the old consular service previously, the number of political appointees in the State Department itself has skyrocketed. I saw one statistic where as recently as 1980, of the senior positions at state, and that's, I think, Deputy Assistant Secretary and above, 80% were career and 20% were appointees. And I think now it's the reverse. It's 80% appointees. And I think in the last administration, it went above 80%, maybe to 90%. So that's another aspect of the political appointee phenomenon that I think is worth noting. We have a few more minutes here, so keep submitting your questions. Somebody's asking about cyber and whether, when you're in an embassy, with all the classified information, all that's going on, do you sense a cyber threat or kind of a threats to the information, the classified information at post? And what forms do those threats take?
There's been press reporting several times over the last decade or so of the State Department's unclassified email system being hacked, and how accurate that is, I couldn't really tell you. I think our secure systems are pretty secure. A lot of steps are taken to at a post overseas to ensure that sensitive stuff is kept in either literal but small boxes or at least electronic small boxes. The bigger risks come more often than not, I suspect, come in Washington or elsewhere outside of an embassy context. It's a serious problem, and a lot of attention is paid to that in the panoply of security concerns that leaders at our embassies overseas have.
Margo, how do you see that? As a public information officer, where we're trying to impact the local population, with the new media. I mean, do you see threats there, or a kind of a competition on how that's done with other countries? I mean, Chinese public diplomacy or Russian? You're on mute.
Whole question of disinformation, and just today I saw an Associated Press article talking about how the Russians have been spreading disinformation videos about the war in Ukraine through the messaging service Telegram. They just goes out and people don't know where they cut all the links. It's not clear where it comes from, and they believe it. And so yes, disinformation and use of cyber is a huge problem and a huge threat. Both as for disinformation and also for disruption, let alone in our own domestic and others' domestic political lives.
I see Todd is coming on here. I think that means we're coming to the end. There's a lot of questions still outstanding, excellent questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but maybe we'll have a follow-up sometime. So Todd, I turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Thomas. And I want to thank our panelists who are outstanding, as always, on this. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Minnesota Committee on Foreign Relations, Global Minnesota, and the Museum of Russian Art. We have programs coming up. Those of you that are on the mailing list for East West Connections received a note today we will be one of the co-sponsors of the Kiev Ballet at Northrop on October 26th. We have greatly reduced prices for off the regular price. If you are on our mailing list, then you received a note today on that, on how to register and receive those tickets. If you're not, you will get a email soon with an invitation to join. We also will be a co-sponsor for the Georgia Ballet later on this year. And we have programs coming up later this month on the cost of the war in Ukraine and later on the role of disinformation, which frankly, we could have done an entire, Margo got started getting into it, but we could have done another 6 hours on disinformation and the role of disinformation. I especially
Todd, could I say, I see people are leaving. Before people do leave, we had a number of questions from probably younger listeners asking, how does one get into the Foreign Service? How long does it take? And I would just say, go to a website, careers.state.gov. And a lot of the information is spelled out there fairly clearly, both on internships and also how to join the Foreign Service or to join the civil service at the State Department. So once again, careers.state.gov. I just wanted to interject that, Todd, since there were some inquiries.
Yeah. And I also want to thank our technical genius, Sergei Kuznetsov, without whose effort, this would have been a very short, non-existent program. So on that note, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure. I'm glad everybody was here tonight and hope everybody has a good week. God bless. Thank you.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks. You were wonderful. Absolutely wonderful, Margo and Ross, Tom.